So welcome everyone. I've just begun recording this meeting for our YouTube channel for Rebuild North Bay under the C2C Community to Community Survivor Network. Our goal is to really bring to newly fire affected communities, people who've already experienced these disasters, and have some sort of a toolkit, if you will, of things that are systems that have worked for us or not worked, if that's the case. The goal that you all will be able to adapt them in your area. I knew we were having Santa Cruz on here, so I'm just waiting to see if they pop on. We do have a lot of Oregon. I think Supervisor Coonerty from Santa Cruz was supposed to jump on, so I'm just going to give him another minute. But again, we do record these, and so you are very welcome to visit our YouTube channel and take them and share them. I'm going to go on mute for a moment. Okay, I thought it was maybe somebody who was trying to get on, but it is one of those warranty people. So I would like to know what they're doing with the rest of their lives when they're not busy interrupting ours. Okay, let me give it one more minute. So just as an intro, what we try to do in the community to community meetings is actually deliver the topics that are requested from the survivor communities. As you know, what that looks like over, there are stages to recovery and survive and for survivors. And we are still within the first, 6 months of what occurred in Santa Cruz at the CZU Lightning Complex fires and the Alameda fire in Southern Oregon. This meeting was specifically asked for by the Survivor Network. Julie is on, and she said, we really like to start to talk about housing. And that's a good sign that you're at that stage already. We have 3 speakers for you today. And I'm especially proud to say, so we have Larry Florin, who is on our board, and he's also the CEO of the largest nonprofit affordable housing developer and manager in our region. And so he has now been through, 5 disasters. He was the CAO in Napa during the Napa earthquake, and then comes to us the wealth of experience. When Paradise happened, he really started communicating a lot with Seana, our second speaker, Seana O'Shaughnessy. And I'm really excited to hear from her about how she sort of implemented maybe some of the lessons that she learned, but also improved upon the system. That's entirely our expectation, is that you will become better at this than we are. We like that. And then we're going to finish out with Sidra Goldwater from Fannie Mae. As you all know, Fannie Mae has been one of our most valuable and trusted partners since the very beginning. And we're very excited because Sidra is going to actually show a new product that they have that can really level the playing field for how to redevelop these manufactured home parks in a way that allows for home ownership and remove sort of the predatory lending practices that have been such a standard of care, if you want to call it, in that industry. And we really think it will be a game changer. So without further ado, Larry, if you could just talk about your experience a little bit, and then we can ask a couple of questions, then we'll move on to Seana. We'll save most of the questions for after, if you're comfortable doing it that way. Larry, Go ahead.
Okay, I think I've got myself off mute. So good afternoon, Larry Florin. And it's funny that you have Seana after me, because we've sort of been partners in crime, I guess is the best way to put this, between the North Bay here at Sonoma County and Butte County and Paradise. So I think I like to say we go through things a year before they do, and so we're able to anticipate for what's coming down next. And usually I'm bet with a, you're kidding me, they really did that. But as Jennifer mentioned, I'm the CEO now of Burbank Housing. We're a nonprofit based in Sonoma County, been around for 41 years and have built a little over 5,000 units of affordable housing. We currently have about 3,500 units that we own and run and manage. We also do home ownership, and so we've been across the affordable spectrum, but we only do affordable housing. That's our only business. And as Jennifer also mentioned, I guess one of the benefits of being old is that I'm now on my fifth major disaster, fifth, fourth, third, fourth or fifth, I can't remember. Going back to the Loma Prieta earthquake, I was actually at the time working in the mayor's office in San Francisco for Mayor Agnos, and got to experience things firsthand back then. And then the South Napa earthquake when I was the county administrator in Napa, and the Valley Fire we had there. So the North Bay fires were sort of a long line of disasters. And I can tell you that there's been huge progress made, at least from where I sit, in terms of responding. The emergency services groups have come a huge way in terms of coordinating and responding to fires, but I can't say the same has really happened on the recovery side. On the recovery side, which is the long-term process that occurs when you sort of have come through shock and realized how are we going to rebuild what was destroyed. It is a very, very, very tedious, difficult process. There are a number of groups, fortunately, that are out there now trying to use best practices and try to come up with a playbook that can be used across different communities, which hadn't really existed, at least as we could say, for recovery. And so I think the work that North Bay has been doing has been good in terms of trying to create connections between communities like this, where we can hopefully share some of the experiences we have. And so I'm definitely interested in hearing some of the questions that are coming up. But all told, I think, I don't remember the totals anymore, but it's about 6,000 units of housing. I think we lost about 6,000 units of housing in the North Bay fires in 2017. Many of those were lost through when the fire came through Santa Rosa. That was really the focus of a lot of the destruction. And there was two particular areas that were actually three that were most dramatically impacted. Fountain Grove, where there were high-end homes. Coffee Park, which was a subdivision. It's really a middle-class, working-class home. And a project that that Burbank's been working on now since 2018, which was the Journey's End Mobile Home Park, which was 162 units of mobile homes. 117 were destroyed in the fires, but the site was left uninhabitable. And if any of your communities are like the North Bay, mobile homes are the reality for affordable housing for a lot of our communities. So losing that mobile home meant that 160 families, in essence, and they were predominantly seniors, lost their affordable housing. And so we, as an organization, focused on that as a rebuilding project to bring our skill set, hopefully, to bear to try to be able to not replace the mobile homes, but to show what rebuilding and recovery look like. I think the term now is build back better. And that's what we were trying to do with Journey's End. In the process, we learned a lot of very hard lessons, and we're still learning them. The project is fully funded now and fully approved for development, but getting here has been painstaking. And I really appreciate the opportunity to share some of those experiences, because hopefully they can inform what you do going forward. So the project that we're ultimately going to build, it's 13 acres, and we are subdividing and building 162 units of senior affordable housing to replace permanent senior affordable housing, to replace the mobile homes. Because of the dense nature of the community that surrounds it, rebuilding it as mobile homes didn't make sense from a land use perspective, and it also didn't make sense from a resiliency and recovery. We wanted to build back. We wanted to build structures that could withstand fires if when they came through the community. And so we're building in 3 phases, 162 units. We're starting with 94 units. We expect to break ground in September at this point, and for the first 94 units, and then phases 2 and 3 will depend on the funding that comes after that. So there are resources that became available in disasters that we all sort of became familiar with on the fly. And so some of these I'm going to use terminology, so please feel free to in the chat or in the questions, but the biggest resource that we came across in terms of being able to rebuild housing was through HUD, and it was the Community Development Block Grant, CDBG, disaster recovery. And those are funds that are allocated by Congress, and they're intended specifically, as they're stated, for community development projects, and housing is a permitted use for those funds. So in our case, 127 million, I think, in community development block grant disaster recovery funds were allocated to the North Bay, were allocated to the state of California for the 2017 fires. It took, and it's still taking, an extraordinarily long time to get those funds out on the street. So the funds were allocated, I believe it was 2018, and there's a story behind that. And then the state of California, through the Department of Housing and Community Development, got the allocation. They had to put together an action plan. The action plan said where they were going to spend that money. And then they needed to set up a mechanism for how they were going to get the money out. And every step of that way was painstakingly slow. And in disaster and recovery, it's all about trying to get people back into their homes as quickly as possible. It's not that the urgency wasn't there, the processes were not set up to really move quickly. And that's become a continuing sort of mantra about this, is about how slow the bureaucracy moves in terms of being able to respond. Some of this, we hope, is that we were a test case as the first time, and it was actually the first time that the state of California, from what I understand, got an allocation of CDBG disaster recovery. So some of this was a learning experience, and Seana will have to probably tell you whether or not they've learned anything the second time around, because she literally has been experiencing the second round of CDBG disaster recovery that came for the Paradise fires, or the Butte County fires. But the other, so that was one major source of funding. The way that the state allocated that funding, by the way, which would be important, I think, for you as you start to look at that as a potential source of funding, was they split that pot into replacing, not just replacing one for one, but like in our case, we did with the mobile home park, they're replacing single family homes. They're making eligible for funding multifamily projects to replace single family home projects, with the idea that you could build, you could consolidate into structures as opposed to just building single homes. They set aside a separate fund, and I think they put this is the state of California, put $64 million into this fund to help homeowners in rebuilding their structures. So they basically spoke to two separate types of prototypes, or typologies, we call it in the business, multifamily and single family homes. We were able to benefit from the source that was for multifamilies, and we got, I think it was $12 million for the an allocation for out of the CDBG-DR. We were also able to utilize something that we frankly had covered by a little bit by mistake. We met, a group of us went to Washington a couple of times to try to lobby for federal assistance. And one of the programs that was made aware to us was this use of one-time disaster, they call them 9% low-income housing tax credits for disaster recovery. And in 2000, I'm gonna get the dates wrong, but I think it was 2002, in response to Hurricane Katrina, at the time, Congress allocated, or told the IRS they could allocate these tax credits. It's tax credits, way too difficult, too much brain damage to explain how tax credits work, except to tell you that 80%, I think it's now 80% of the affordable housing that's built in the country utilizes tax credits. So they are a tremendous source of equity to be able to rebuild housing. And so this allocation, what they allocated was $100 million in tax credits for the rebuilding after 2017 fires. That $100 million actually, it's $100 million in credits over 10 years. So it really, think about it as $1 billion. They essentially gave $1 billion to the state of California to help with rebuilding. The state actually went through a fairly streamlined process, given the state and the way they work on this allocation of these credits. We spent a lot of time knocking heads to make sure that the rules around the credits were written in a way that would allow them to actually be used for the projects that are related to recovery. In the end, we got close. We didn't get 100% of the way there, but we got pretty close. And we were able to compete for and get an allocation of tax credits for the mobile home park project that we're talking about. We got $40 million in essence for that project. So between the combination of the community development block grant, disaster relief, and the 9% disaster tax credits, we're going to be able to build what is going to be a $56 million project to provide housing for as many of those 162 residents who lost their homes in the fires as possible. Not all, of course, want to come back. You know, the amount of time it takes to get a project built just forces people to take other routes, unfortunately, to be able to stabilize their lives and get on with their lives. So we don't know at this point precisely how many folks are going to be interested in moving back to the site once we're able to rebuild it. We've been told anecdotally about 40 to 50 of the 160 families are anxiously awaiting the move back. But nonetheless, it was very important for this community and for that to be able to rebuild that. So the combination of those we're able to provide the funding that we needed to be able to move forward with this project. And like I said, in September, we hope to be in the ground and to be able to show the world what recovery really looks like in building back better. We also were able to avail ourselves of a couple of provisions. This was again in state law here, so it's specific to California, but having to do with how you expedite approvals, because the entitlement process, getting a project approved, even in disasters, can be sometimes very challenging, and it has been. But we were able to use some specific state-enabled legislation that allowed us to expedite the approvals for the process. So that, in a nutshell, is kind of a case study. I don't have any pictures. I probably should have come prepared with some pictures of what the project will look like. But it's sort of one very specific example of how you can piece the resources together. The lesson, I guess, that we learned was stay in touch with your state, federal officials that are allocating resources to make sure that the resources go to where they're most needed, that the rules, and this is a really important lesson, that the rules are written in a way that allows you to access those resources. Just because the resources have been allocated by Congress doesn't mean that those will be actually funds that you'll be able to get access to. They can be written, the rules can be written in such a way that they've become almost unusable as a result. So those are really important, and it really is important to have a group of you from whatever community you are, staying in touch with those and continuing to lobby. Frankly, be a little politically incorrect, be a pain in the ass. Just be in front of them and don't be afraid to, on behalf of your community, to be able to get them to rewrite these rules so that they are in fact usable, and don't accept no for an answer. The story behind the CDBG-GR was that it was actually being held up. So the fire was in 2017. The previous administration, the Trump administration, was in place at that time. And it's not a great secret that they were not the friendliest to the state of California. We don't always see eye to eye. And so 3 of us from the rebuild board went to Washington, and we actually were able to get a meeting with, at the time, well, he ultimately was chief of staff, Mick Mulvaney, and talk about the allocation and the need for our resources. And he explained to me that, in fact, the White House was holding up these resources because they weren't sure that we'd be able to reuse them or that they would actually go for recovery. We were able to explain to him how the funds would be utilized in the local community. And literally the next day, the White House lifted its hold on those funds. And that's the $127 million. I think actually it was another source of funds, which was 180
It
million.
was 80. It was coupled with Puerto Rico. So we had to have one of our board members call Mick Mulvaney when he was chief of staff and get it uncoupled. But you know, that's a terrible lesson, but it is true that it did work. So
yeah, and so we got those resources, and that really was just getting in front of the people, explaining to them exactly what you were trying to do and why and how it was going to help the recovery. And unfortunately, we heard stories about how Houston, since they had their floods, was sending every year, they were sending a delegation to Washington to make sure that they got their resources.
Well, we did too, but they started doing it like every month.
Yeah.
So we took our cues from them for sure. I wanted to make sure that we were mindful of time because Larry, I want to get Seana up next, but I know that Julie has a series of questions for you. So let's take about 7 to 10 minutes to answer those questions. So I can get to Seana in case you both have questions before we move on to Sidra. I just want to make sure all the information gets out there.
There's also one question from Kathy in the chat. So once Julie's done, I'll share that.
Awesome. Lawrence, thank you so much for all of this. And I know that I'm probably going to be back in contact with some more detailed questions as we go into this. So one of the quick questions I have is, we are hearing from a lot of the community members who were part of the mobile home parks, their real hesitation to not be able to go back into a mobile home park. They're still buying into this idea that they have ownership somehow. And I know that there's a lot of fiction around that, and they're actually sort of not setting themselves up for long-term financial support, equity. But was there a way that you guys talked to them about moving from manufactured home park ownership to moving into affordable housing? Because really I know that's a conversation we're going to have.
Yeah, really good question. We probably spent the first year to 2 years meeting individually with every one of the 162 residents, or actually 5, I think, were killed in the fire, but they're heirs. So we 160, excuse me, of the residents. We met with them, each of them individually. And there's also, they have their rights when you reutilize a project like we're doing. We had to pay for relocation under the Federal Uniform Relocation Act. We had to enter into actually contractually binding agreements with all of the residents. We had a local philanthropic organization called Tipping Point that came in. They came in with a huge, they're an incredible organization based in San Francisco. They actually put on a concert at the time was called AT&T Park, and the proceeds from that concert went to help pay for many programs here in the recovery. And one of those was the relocation expenses for those residents. So we actually had to spend time meeting with each one of them individually. And yeah, there was that concern, many of them, that they own their homes. They don't own the land, to be clear, they own their physical structure that they lived in. The reality was that in order to rebuild, that if the mobile home park owner was going to put it back into use as a mobile home, they would have to go out and buy new mobile homes. And most of these folks, the mobile homes that they would have to buy will be far out of range for what they could afford. And so there was a practical reality that took them a while to figure out. The insurance that they had was not going to come anywhere close to being able to buy a replacement mobile home. These were mobile homes in part that were 20, 30, 40 years old. They had very little value. And so it would be having to buy what probably would have been a $200,000 to $300,000 home for someone who's on fixed income, mostly Social Security. And so it was I don't want to say a grieving process. It was probably, we literally had social workers working with them to help them to understand that going back in its current form was not a viable option. Okay. The money spoke volumes, of course. That always helps in the relocation process. But really, it was the social workers working individually with every one of them to explain to them why this was the best alternative. In the end, we had we had zero opposition when we went before the city council to get the project approved. We had nobody oppose it. And we had 23 residents who wrote letters basically saying, hurry up, get this done, get it rezoned, get a plan. So, but that was 2 years of painstaking work to get there.
Thank you for that time frame too.
Sure.
So one of the things, just because acknowledge that I'm a huge advocate of what Rebuild North Bay is doing, and I hope they just multiply all over the place. But I keep hearing you referring to we, and I really want to make sure that you clarify the power of that we that you have developed. Is that Rebuild? Is that something that above and beyond Rebuild? Because I think that's one of the things that our community needs to coalesce around, about having that singular force. So I'd love to see if you could speak to that.
Yeah, that's a good question. And for certain aspects, and Jennifer may not totally like this answer, but I'm going to give it anyway. For part of this, the we was Rebuild, and it was really, in my world, it was around the advocacy parts of it. It was being able to put the community together to go and meet with the state and federal officials to make them understand that we were on top of it, that we knew what we were doing, but that these were critically needed resources, and why. And that was the important part of the we in this, was really being able to advocate to the funders to be able to come in with the resources that were necessary to rebuild.
I agree with that statement, and I have
Okay.
no issue with it, because I think advocacy should actually, us blending advocacy in with our nonprofit, even though we followed all of the rules, was also problematic in some ways. And so there could be an improvement upon that, and I have some ideas about that. But when he talks about the advocacy to DC, that was those were Rebuild North Bay trips. But there are many ways to go about that. The important thing is that you advocate, and that you know you're entitled to be heard.
You know, the other we, though, of course, and as a former public official, is the government, is getting communities together. And it should be like a no-brainer that everybody will work together. They don't. I mean, people at the beginning, people pull together to fight the fires, to deal with the immediate urgent issues most times. But when it comes to recovery, it becomes, what can we get for ourselves? What can we get for our community? And so how do you bring the communities together into one shared collective vision to make sure that the right projects are getting built, the right to really facilitate the recovery? That's actually been a struggle in Sacramento too, because they have a process that doesn't necessarily enlist or incorporate in any productive way the input of the local jurisdictions. And so that's been an ongoing battle being fought really on the government to government level, where nonprofits behind them, fighting to make sure that the rules that are written in a way that coordinates with what the community is doing. So just as an example, when I mentioned about these 9% tax credits, the first process that went through for our community, they ended up funding 5 projects, the state did, through these tax credits, 3 of which, if you went to the local community, in this case, Santa Rosa, they would have told you we're not priority projects for this community in terms of the rebuilding. So the state was operating over here, the local community was operating over here. How do you bring them together? The first is, how do you get the local community to speak in one voice, to go to speak to the state, to make sure that the right projects are getting funded? That's a process that's not easy. It sounds like it should be a no-brainer. It's not, because every jurisdiction is going to really protect their own turf in that sense. And so bringing the other we is, how do you get the collective community through the governmental agencies, entities, to speak as one voice?
Great. I have one last question.
Okay, and then we'll move on to Seana, because I have to make sure that we get you all this information. Julie, go. You just go for it, girl.
So this one, you probably were just going to send me some stuff to follow up with, but I love the idea that there are some processes that you went through, that you recognize, the action plan, the mechanism, all of that kind of stuff. Is there some of that we could actually get a jump start on? I know that these CBDGs monies take a long time, but if we know that, like, here's a stumbling block you're going to get to, like, can we get some of that information from you now, so that we can be like, start, like, hello government, you're going to have to put an action plan together. Let's start doing that now. So that we're a few steps ahead of
That's probably a good segue to Seana on that, because she's the second person to be working on the action plan. But there is something actually also being worked on by, there's a group that both Seana and I are part of, a California Coalition for Rural Housing. And they put together a proposal for a bill in Sacramento that in essence becomes a gap financing fund. They put $500 million and it's been introduced, which would, because it could take 2-3 years or longer for these CDBG-DR funds to get out, to provide that funding in the interim to allow these projects to move forward. And there's actually an author in Sacramento now who's introduced the bill. And so there's getting behind that would provide the resources. Not directly answering your question, I don't know if there is anything that can be done outside of the regular formalized process, but because HCD has there are rules. HUD writes these rules, HCD is supposed to implement them on behalf of the state of California. And so it's a little hard to get out ahead of the official, for instance, Federal Register declaration that comes out about the disaster. But I'm not going to be very helpful on that answer, and maybe Seana will be better at that than I am about getting ahead.
Let's go ahead. Thank you so much. Let's segue to Seana, but I want to say this, that we will send out Larry's contact information, and very happy to help. Thank you, Iko Sophie, for putting up the Rural Housing Initiative, but we will also make Larry available to you. Right, Larry?
Sure.
Okay, Seana, welcome.
Thank you. And Larry has been incredibly helpful to me, and it's been tremendous, becoming friends and working on projects and sharing information. To answer your question, Julie, specifically, and then I'll talk a little bit about my experience. And then I do actually want to very briefly kind of find out who's in the room. So getting ahead of CDBG-DR. So we knew from Sonoma County's experience that CDBG-DR could be delayed. Our Housing and Community Development, that is the state agency, was determined to not screw it up as badly as they did with Sonoma County. But as much as we were trying to be prepared and have all the data, they had to go through their data collection process, because CDBG-DR specifically is intended to address unmet need. So they had to do a data collection process and then broad programs to meet the unmet needs. So the best thing that you can do to prepare is make sure that you're able to tell the story of your need through data. So kind of having those community voices advocating, making sure it's not just the people that normally get talked to are part of the process. And then by the time you get to the public comment part, most of the program design is done. So like figuring out how to insert yourself into conversations earlier. So OEM, you're going to be in those conversations earlier and trying to figure out how to get community voices before the public hearing when they've already baked it and nothing's going to change is important. And then as Larry explained, there's certain buckets that the money is set for, and it's mostly housing. They'll do owner occupied rehab. If mobile home parks are important, figuring out how to do that. Multifamily rental and what that looks like. And then we ended up with some economic development and infrastructure. So in Houston, for example, they separated the infrastructure mitigation dollars. In our allocation, they combined them. So the official bios there has nothing to do with disasters. I grew up in Paradise. I left, I moved back. I ended up at CHIP. The Campfire, my parents lost their home. So kind of dealt with the disaster on a very personal level. CHIP lost this building behind us. It was a tax credit project. Larry talked about tax credits. This was a 36 unit building that burned. We're not the first tax credit project that's been destroyed by a disaster, but we are the first one that burned down. There have been some that have been impacted by hurricanes, which are different in how the recovery works. And and then those of you in town in Phoenix, you understand when it's community-wide destruction, the recovery is a little bit different than when it's only part of a community. And then we obviously had, well, not obviously, we had staff and tenants and friends and family that were all directly impacted. So the kind of collective community impact was pretty intense. So I can talk a lot about multifamily rebuilding and what that looks like. We did create in Butte County what was at the time we called a long-term recovery group. The long-term recovery group is kind of an official terminology under FEMA, and we morphed into something that was bigger and broader than that. And we've ended up calling ourselves the Campfire Collaborative. And it's a combination of public, private, nonprofit, businesses and individuals that are committed to the recovery efforts. And so we still have a core group. The focus has shifted a little bit, but we've broken ourselves into committees that are doing disaster case management, supporting that, housing, which I'm the co-chair of, volunteer management. SBP is here, but with COVID, we were kind of derailed with the volunteer groups coming in to help rebuild, but hoping that will come back, and you guys might be in a good place. And spiritual and emotional wellness, which is kind of a non-denominational multi-group. And then there's the town and the county and all of that. Julie, when did the long-term recovery group? We shifted after about a year and a half into it. It was kind of when FEMA was kind of like, you guys aren't really, doing this long-term recovery group. And so we're like, okay, we don't want to close down because there's still a lot left to do. But we don't want to fit in this box that is long-term recovery group. So we're going to figure out what works for our community. And it's super helpful having that cross sector. It's a pretty big tent. We don't have everyone in the room, but we have a lot of people in it. And it's a great place for the community, the government representatives to share information and to get information and then kind of push it out to the community. It's unique.
Shauna, sorry to interrupt you, but might help though is most of these people have been on lots of calls with Charles Brooks. And then last time I was just, I think it was Kathy Byron who did, and then Karen followed up with North Valley Community Foundation.
Mm-hmm.
And but the housing piece though, like to get to that stage, like how do you think it's good that they're thinking about this now and what the opportunities are? What were you thinking, 4 or 5 months later? Like what stage were you in?
No, thank you for the redirect because I definitely don't want to repeat that structure. But going back to the Community Foundation, because I do want to talk about this because I think that when a community burns, there is an opportunity to rethink what the community looks like and what it means and what you want that community to be. And what we're finding 3 years later is that it's really hard. So we did a lot of work creating a vision around what Paradise could be and what it could look like. And the foundation invested in it. But the kind of combination of when resources hit the community, the private ownership, what people want to do. Julie, you were talking about, mobile home parks and people maybe needing to shift from home ownership in a mobile home park to rental. And then we're further complicated by the lawsuit with PG&E, which has just kind of put a huge percentage of decision-making on hold for individuals. So for us with Paradise Community Village, we were pretty determined from the beginning that we were going to rebuild. And we deal with the issues of, should you be rebuilding? Is it responsible? Why do you even have a community in a fire zone? All of those questions. And I assume similar to you all, like, these are our homes. These have been our homes for decades. These were not dangerous places to build when they were built, and they're our communities, and we're committed to them, and we can make them safer, and we're going to make choices for it. But it's important to rebuild and restore this community. And so how do we do that in a way that is safer and more resilient? So there's kind of that narrative around, should you rebuild, which those of us here are like, yes, we should rebuild, but how do we do that in a way that does address fire safety and resiliency? We had a hard time with our project because we were underinsured, and under the IRS guidelines, we only had 2 years to rebuild. So we are one of the few nonprofits that got FEMA public assistance, which is usually given to jurisdictions because it's pretty hard money to use. But between insurance and public assistance and private fundraising, we had enough money to rebuild. And then we finally got an extension from the IRS because of COVID. So, but it was 2.5 years of complete stress of how are we going to do it? We have 222 people on the waiting list for this project. On the owner-occupied side of things and the rental housing, the struggle that the community is having is how to build back affordably. So even for higher end, low income or moderate income people, the escalating cost of construction because of the multiple wildfires, because of the trade wars, because of COVID, is making affordable construction of any kind feel out of reach, even for people who did have adequate insurance. And that is, it's the thing that we are struggling with every single day, and we don't have a great answer. We don't have a comprehensive answer. We're like kind of nibbling at the edges of this. So one of the things, when we get the CDBG DR, they've increased the per house allocation to like 250. So and it's a grant, and if people have insurance, that combined should be enough to help them rebuild. But they had to wait 3 years. It'll be 3 years before that money hits the community. So are people able to wait that long? And then manufactured housing, was seen as a solution for getting homes back more quickly, like the kind of permanent foundation. What we partner with Fannie Mae, it can have a traditional mortgage, but now they're a year out in that construction. So there's delays on the manufactured housing side. And we haven't, there's been a lot of like, we'll try Rapido or tiny homes or container houses, and we haven't found any solution that's fast and cheap. And part of the issue is our terrain, the elevation, the mountains, kind of all of that makes it harder. And so there's a bit of a reckoning of, will Paradise have the economic diversity that it had prior to the fire? Will we be able to build back an inclusive community that, and it was an affordable community. It was among the most affordable in our region, lots of retirees, and it's not going to be like that naturally. It's going to take intention and a lot of hard work. And we're just still working really, really hard on it. So I guess, it's mental progress as opposed to big progress, but we are making progress. And when you look at what has happened, it's positive. But when you look at what still needs to happen, it's very overwhelming. I know you guys lost about 4,000 units. We lost 14,000 housing units and another 5,000 commercial and other structures. So 19,000 structures throughout the Campfire, which included Paradise in several small communities in the county around. Oh, one other thing is the kind of competition. And so I think it's eased and they try really hard to work together, but the competition for resources between jurisdictions. So the county versus the town versus Paradise is the biggest town with the biggest loss, but the smaller communities all around, which are, resources are funneled through the county, but they have their own identity. And so working really, really hard to not compete, but to collaborate to make the resources go further is something that's really important. And there was some leadership shifts that I think is making that possible in our region, but that is probably one of the harder things because the even though we're getting millions and millions of dollars in recovery dollars, it's not enough to rebuild.
So I'm going to, we have about 6 minutes left to ask questions of Larry and Seana. So I always think 90 minutes is so long, and then we get in these and I'm like, I need like 90 more minutes than I have. We will, everyone, can you make sure that you've put your email address in the chat, and including, we'll make sure that you get the contact information for Seana and Larry, but let's open it up to questions.
So Tom, Barry Long's UDC's work was great. It was mostly focused on the town of Paradise. They did not create the long-term recovery group, but they did interface with the long-term recovery group for input and feedback in the visioning process. And it was a great vision, and it was very healing for people to be able to come together and kind of see what could happen. The town is using it for priority projects and things that they're working on, but kind of like the grand vision of what could be, I think is harder to do because of the issues that I laid out. But it was a great thing to do, and it was very positive, and it is helpful, and the town is using it. But
you think it may have pulled the county and the city together at all?
No, it was focused on the town. So it may have contributed a little bit to the separation, but it wasn't meant to be a countywide process.
Other questions?
There's one in the chat from Tucker about, Sean, your work with Habitat. Sorry.
Yeah, so this is where scale is hard. So, so Habitat individually got a lot of resources that came into the community that they're using to rebuild. And there were a lot of donations, which the Campfire, the long-term recovery group, created a donation platform to get them out, but it was a lot of like furniture and clothing and water and things like that. There were some offers of construction materials that I think could be great, but like in 3 months after a fire is not when you need that donation. You need it 12 to 18 months. And so the mismatch of that. But I think that there is opportunity with in-kind donations. We haven't fully cracked that nut. And then actually, I think, Lisa, you were with SBP. You may speak to that, or maybe it's Kathy, I don't know. St. Bernard Parish, Marley, sorry, wrong person, Marley. I mean, there are organizations that focus on coming in and helping people rebuild, and they have well-established networks for donating materials and volunteers, and they can help with that system. They're not typically in wildfire areas, so they're learning to adjust their models for fire rebuilds, because with hurricanes, it's remodeling as opposed to building new. But I think it's possible. COVID was like right when we were ready to start accepting those groups and people were being identified, COVID hit and you couldn't have large volunteer groups. But you guys might be in a good position just where you're ready in your recovery and COVID maybe not, being manageable.
I just want to follow up. I guess I wasn't necessarily speaking about Habitat's sort of working model of sort of volunteer rebuilding, but we had a good meeting with Brandon up here from Habitat the other day, and we have a potential resource for 6 semis of underpriced lumber that's all good and structurally sound a week, and when that can come into the valley and what kind of scale we need to create some sort of economy of scale to actually afford to affect the affordability sort of dialogue, and what kind of what sort of scale would we need to create for the region, or at least for the area, to actually make an impact on the affordability. Because during the fire, actively during the Alameda fire, units of 2x4s are going up by 30%. So it's pretty rough times.
Our lumber on PCV from bid to start of construction went up 30%. I mean, and it's awful. So anything that you can secure, like do it proactively and then figure out who's going to use it later, honestly.
Yeah. I would jump in on that too. That I think I'm going to have to jump off in a second here, but costs are a huge issue. They continue to drive up the scarcity of resources. Any place you can get below market or donated is great, as long as it's in good shape. We did actually bid. We had a project that was ready to go to construction. Final bids were in September 2017. Then October 17, the fires hit. The bids went stale. We rebid it, and over the 3 months, the price had gone up 15%. And since then, they're closer to 30%. So you will see price escalation in your area as a result of increased demand. That's just unfortunately a fact of life. That's going to happen.
It is 3 o'clock, so I want to say thank you so much, Larry. Good to see you. Always appreciate you. And Seana, I'm actually really happy because I haven't been able to hear you on a call, so it was a fun new experience for me too. And I really appreciate you taking the time. If you can hang around and listen to what Sidra has to say, it's really fascinating, and I think could be a game changer for many communities, because as we know, there are many paths to get home. And it's not going to be just 1 or 2, but this is one of those that might be able to build some equity into the process. So thank you. Okay, and so welcome to Sidra.
Thank you. And I think Sophie has a deck that she's going to share, because I'm going to get pretty technical pretty quickly. And I apologize if if I do. I spent a decade writing policy, so if you don't understand something, please just stop me and ask me to translate it into sort of normal English. So can you fast forward a couple of slides? So I've been asked to sort of talk about alternative ways of financing resident-owned manufactured housing communities. And this is, as Jennifer was saying, this is probably one of the most affordable ways, particularly after a fire, to rebuild a community. So next slide. So one of the things I want to be clear about when I'm talking about manufactured homes is that this is not a prefab home, this is not a tiny home, this is not a modular home. This is defined by HUD. And so one of the key things here is that it has a certification label, and most people will call this a HUD tag. And that is a key thing to being able to get conventional financing. So there's a lot of limits on what Fannie and Freddie can buy in terms of mortgages. And having that HUD tag is the key #1 factor. And so what that means is, what a manufactured home can be. It can be, it's factory built. It can be either a single or multiple sections. There is a newer product called MH Advantage, which basically, I think you're seeing an example of that on the screen on the right, which basically looks almost like a traditional sort of stick-built, site-built home. One of the things is manufactured housing parks are different than, and I think Larry talked about this, is that it's a very different model than we think about when you put a house on a piece of land that we all own. Generally, the home and the land are two separate entities. And so someone may own their home, but they may not own the land. And so one of the key things that for it to be, for us, Fannie Mae or Freddie Mac, to purchase that loan is that the home and the land need to be owned together. And so that's a little bit different than a lot of these, MH communities historically have been. And so that's, a bit of a novelty. And so that's where we one of the reasons that fire impacted communities are a good way of looking at this new model is that you're starting from scratch. A lot of these are owned by folks off-site. Somebody owns the land and they may not have the money to rebuild. And so it's like, let's think about this creatively. Let's think about this. How can we build equity for folks in your community? So next slide. And so one of the things that we really want to get to is that affordability piece. And so the other reason that sort of a manufactured home differs from a traditional sort of home is that a manufactured home is generally, you buy it through a loan called a chattel mortgage versus sort of a traditional 30-year conventional mortgage. Chattel loans are viewed as much riskier, and that's because it's secured by personal property. You may say, oh, it's a home, but from a legal perspective, it's viewed as personal property, and it's really basically almost like a really, really, really big car loan is the way I would view it as. It's much higher interest rates, it's shorter term, which really impacts the payment affordability versus if if you can get to that conventional loan, you're talking a 30-year mortgage, you're talking much lower interest rates, a much broader spectrum of folks who are willing to do that lending. So next slide. And so what I'm proposing here, what we're trying to sort of propose as a new model is a resident home owned co-op. And so one of the key things here, and this is a bit different, there are MH co-ops out there already, but usually the way the MH co-op is structured is, again, is the co-op owns the land and then the owner owns the unit separately. The owner may be able to get a mortgage for the co-op portion for the land, but they would still have to get a chattel mortgage for the unit. And so what we're proposing is really, since we're starting from scratch, is where the MH co-op structure would own both the unit and the land together. And so you're like, well, why can't you do it separately? And so unfortunately, there's a little IRS rule out there. And if you want to try to take on the IRS, please go ahead and do so. But I don't think that we're going to be able to change their rules. But it's this IRS code 216. And so in that code, it says for, basically, a conventional loan to be issued in a co-op, the unit and the land needs to be held together, and that basically all of the shares need to be of equivalent nature. And so those are the two key factors there. And so that's why, that's the benefit of having the MH co-op own both the unit and the land. Now, the other advantage of having a co-op structure is that, and I'm sure many of you are aware, that not only were the units destroyed, but a lot of the underlying infrastructure was destroyed and needs to be rebuilt. And so that could be the roads, it could be electrical, septic systems, it could be a myriad of things. And what can pay for that is what's called an underlying mortgage. And that's basically a mortgage that is paid through the condo or co-op fees. Now, with a condo structure, yes, you can get an underlying mortgage. However, that is secured by the income stream for the co-op. Basically, the fees that the homeowners, the condo owners pay. As the GSEs, Fannie and Freddie Mac, can't purchase those loans on the multifamily side, because again, it goes back to we can only purchase loans that are secured by property. And so if you use a co-op structure and that co-op takes a underlying mortgage to pay for those items that are owned by the community, those items, we can finance both the multifamily loan as well as the single family loan. And as we said, by doing that, the interest rates are much cheaper. It's viewed as a less risky loan. It's building equity for the homeowners, et cetera. Next slide, please. So, I think, Larry, Seana have all said that, there's different models out there for, MH communities. This is not necessarily the answer for everyone, but if you are trying to build an option where you're trying to build a model for affordable home ownership, this may be something that is suitable for your community. It's not going to be suitable for every MH community. There's still going to be those folks who want to rent. There's advantages to that. There may be resident communities that are structured already differently, which this would not apply for. But this is, again, one of the suite of options out there. And I think one of the key things that everyone you talk to is dealing with disaster impacted communities is that you need a suite of options. It's not one size fits all, but it's, you need a lot of different tools in your chest. And one of the things, manufactured housing has evolved. I think a lot of people are used to, so the old trailer homes, and you've seen some of those, and my boss would just shoot me for using the T word right now, and I see Jennifer laughing at me. But it's, they can be beautiful homes that, are virtually indistinguishable from, a traditional site-built home. And I think that might be the last slide, I forget. So one of the key things, okay, and so why is this also a desirable option for disaster impacted communities? One is it's built off-site. It's, obviously you are going to see a huge dearth of contractors. It's built off-site. It's built to HUD standards that need to be compliant with local codes. So for example, in California code now requires sprinklers in all their homes. All manufactured homes there require those sprinklers, et cetera. And so it's a quicker path to getting, although as Seana did say, it is not as quick as it used to be. And so that is something that we all have to deal with, but it is still a quicker path, utilizing less resources within the community. Next slide. And then, as I think I've said previously, this is a way to build equity for, potential homeowners or existing homeowners who want to rebuild. It allows for a conventional loan that, provides better interest rates than a chattel mortgage. And then one of the things that I think is really important with a co-op or a condo organization, and there are other ways of doing this through CLTs, et cetera, is that you can put in the rules affordability restrictions. It could be that only, folks with certain income levels, below certain income levels can purchase into the home. You can put in things about how much equity can build over time. But those are things that can be built in to make sure it's not just affordable for the initial home buyers, but for the length of time that the co-op community exists. And so I think that's incredibly important, particularly when you're looking long term. And I think the last couple of slides are really just sort of resources. So I've put some links here. I think Jennifer and Aiko Sophie are going to share this deck, but there's links to the Fannie Mae website, the HUD website with some FAQs, my emails there as well. If folks have questions, this does, as I said, get into very nuanced things very quickly, because obviously this still has to comply with state laws, et cetera. But I just wanted to, at least at a high level, share all this information with you. And I apologize, I was not watching the chat, so I do not know if there are questions.
It's okay, I'm watching it, and Julie does have a question. We will send out the deck, so why don't we do a stop share? And Julie, we can all, there's so few of us left, we can come off of mute and use our last, 15 minutes just for questions. Julie, good
Great.
question.
Thanks, Sidra. So you mentioned early on that that co-ops to be funded needed to have the units be of equivalent nature. And so my question is, does that mean that each unit needs to be basically the same size?
No,
or can there can be mixed sizes of houses within
Correct. It has to be basically the homeowner has the same rights as any other home owner. So it's not like, think about it like, if you own stock, what you're purchasing when you purchase a co-op is basically stock in the co-op instead of real estate. And so think about it like, a stock you trade, there's different sometimes levels of stock. So you need to make sure all the stock has equivalent proprietary rights within the co-op corporation. Does that make sense?
No, absolutely. I'm actually the vice president of the local food co-op, so I totally understand that structure. I had not heard equivalent.
No, and as I said, it can get very confusing very quickly. So yeah, you could put a 3-bedroom unit, you could put a 2-bedroom, you could put a 1-bedroom, but it's the shares that have to be the same.
Great. And then I have one other quick question that I know Karen has a great question as well. Have you done any work with the organization Craft 3 in creating some of the gap loans so that a co-op can purchase some land, hold on to it while they're sort of developing the people who will then buy into that co-op and then move into it? Have you done any work with them before? I know that they're interested in trying to create that kind of.
So we're in a sort of a weird position. We've had meetings with various organizations, Rock USA, other organizations out there. We don't actually do the development. We just do the financing of the back end after the buildings have been built and all that kind of stuff. But it's something if we're happy to participate in conversations, but we haven't done that sort of quote unquote legwork because that's just not what we do.
Great. Sidra, you're a wealth of information. Thank you so much for giving us your time.
I can get very nerdy very quickly, so I apologize.
That's great. Thank you.
We love it. We appreciate it. Karen, go ahead and just ask your question. It's a good question.
Hi, Sidra. Do you have an example of a MH co-op? The initial mortgage, the shares, maybe even,
So this is a new model. This is something we're trying to promote. This is whatever it is would be the guinea pigs, and we would definitely be there to handhold the community through this process. We know that this is not going to be, Jennifer and Seana, if she's still on the line, can tell you that we are happy to handhold through these processes. We're not one of those people said, here's a great idea and then scamper away, never to be seen again. But we think that this is a really important tool, particularly for affordable home ownership, which is, you see, in many communities, housing prices just skyrocket after a natural disaster. And so, by putting in those covenants, those restrictions, we view this as something where you can ensure not just for a few years, but for, the life of the association, that it is affordable.
Cool. Well, it would still be awesome if we, even if it's a theoretical example, just something, that all fits, like taking a piece of land and the cost of the homes, the manufactured homes, etc. It'd be great if we could see that.
To build out like a case example.
Yes.
That would be interesting too.
Exactly.
One of the nice things about working with Fannie Mae is I think they really do try to evolve into, they listen to us like for so long. They've been with Seana for a long time, and they will now be with you. And again, it's not a light touch and leave. It's let's actually develop ways to really help your community get back. Like a lot of their policies come out of these conversations, which is very satisfying to watch over the course of these last 3.5 years for us. So Tom, you had a question.
Yeah, Sidra, what would you like a city or county government to do to facilitate this type of project?
Sure, I would say, number one is making sure that a lot of cities have covenants that do not allow for manufactured housing or certain restrictions. So I think that's number one. Anything, I think one of the key things is the land. Anything you can do to facilitate the transfer of land to, is another thing. But that's definitely something we can sit down with you and, figure out. I think, I think that's where you have to be really creative in this piece.
Well, and we had a situation where, you talked about the insurance, or rather the interest rates being so much higher when they're disconnected from the land. And we've had manufactured home parks where we went back and created a planned unit development so they could subdivide the property and connect it with each of the units. Is that what you're advocating with the co-ops, that they be?
So no, so you would still have a co-op association where it would, this association itself would own all the land. It's just each individual unit owner. So you wouldn't have to do the same kind of subdivision that you're talking about, where like you're selling off each little lot. This would still be a community. It's just, it would be, the residents would own the land through the co-op structure.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, sounds like a great idea.
Donna, do you have, I've just been watching, I'm trying to read your mind over Zoom, see what you think.
I just was going to say, Sidra and Fannie Mae are great partners, very creative, and great problem solvers. So if we are a guinea pig on a different project related to manufactured housing, but it's been a great experience. So not as big as a whole co-op, but
bigger in a different way.
So it's good. I mean, it's a good partnership.
Lisa Carreño, what's on your mind?
Well, you guys with Rebuild North Bay Foundation can probably see my mind spinning on the subject of equity. And what I've appreciated about this conversation is how Larry and Sidra have both pointed to the power of these kinds of community conversations to reveal where policy and policy structures have gotten in the way, or are in the way of rebuilding and recovery. So, for example, what you just said a moment ago, Sidra, that there are municipal ordinances that that have been in place probably for many decades that ban manufactured homes that need to be, exposed, revealed, and excavated from rules that otherwise would dictate what can happen in a space where there has been massive destruction and a need for rebuilding. And then the power of this kind of a coalition to have those conversations, raise awareness, galvanize support, and make those changes. I was very, very struck by Shauna's observation and concern that in Paradise, there's a lot of fear that what Paradise becomes in rebuilding is not what Paradise was prior to rebuilding. That it's not as diverse a community, that it's not as accessible a community to people across a wide range of income earnings, streams. And for young families, for individuals who are trying to get their first home, for seniors who are on fixed incomes. My own mom and dad live in the Atlanta area. And as much as I would like for them to move out here, they can't sell that home and move out here and live comfortably, because it is just impossibly expensive for them to replace what they live in here in Sonoma County. So I appreciate everybody's attention to this to this whole equity and recovery and rebuilding. I did share with Seana that here in Sonoma County we undertook over a 3-year period of time an analysis of what putting equity and climate resiliency in the center of our rebuilding and recovery would look like. And so we call that process Map 1 Sonoma and develop decision-making criteria. United Way of the Wine Country is stewarding that project now. So I'd be happy to talk offline with any of you about that. Jen was a part of the development of the wisdom that has come out of that, and an identification of the equity levers, particularly a wide range of affordable and diverse housing as a major equity and climate resilience building lever for communities.
I just had a thought about that, Lisa, as you described it. We, perhaps as we put together something in the way of a cooperative, which is unique and might be different than any of the 2 communities we're working with have considered, is maybe coming in with a package that advocates specific changes to some of the code requirements. We had a situation in Central Point where I work years ago, 20 years ago now, where we never developed a mixed use transit oriented development. And so the consultant working with the property owner in that particular instance came in with a whole set of codes that we could kind of insert into our municipal code that made it feasible and acceptable. We've tweaked it over the years, but it seems like you could probably incorporate some of the resilience and policy related criteria into a package, if you will, and introduce that. And in these little towns that Julie's familiar with, they don't really have the staff capacity to make code changes fast enough to facilitate a new project like that. And so if you could come in with maybe an idea or a ready-made plug and play sort of a code requirement, that might be well received.
I think this conversation is, Jennifer, thank you again for setting it up, even though I asked for it. But I do, I do think that there's an awakening to people actually starting to think about what are some of this potential for solutions. We're out of that intense trauma period, which not that people aren't still going through trauma, they are, but the intensity has definitely started to step back. And what I'm hoping as the representative for the co-op, the food co-op, which is a really financially successful company here in the Valley, how do we take that strength and create sort of the cornerstone or the building block for doing this kind of a cooperative housing kind of project and support it in whatever ways we can. And so I would love to see if we could And I also know that there's a group of Latinx community members who are trying to start a housing cooperative and really want to try and do that. I think they need some guidance, and I would love to see if we can do a follow-up on this.
Happy
Tom,
to meet with them separately. Yeah.
Yeah, and Tom, I'd love for you to be engaged, just because there's going to need to be that, you know, how do we connect in with the government and the county entities to make this happen? It's not just about buying land and getting it financed, but it's really about making sure that it's something that the city's going to approve and move forward with.
And maybe we can to have another, you know, just a conversation where we talk, we've done like how to work with the public sector and how to advocate. But maybe we can also talk about, just not on a recorded call necessarily, but some strategies to make sure that you're working in partnership with. Just think that's so important. It's which, you know, I think Seana could not have illustrated it better, that there was, you know, the dam. It did become easier after a certain people departed their positions. And then all of a sudden things can coalesce sometimes. So sometimes it's that, sometimes it's a personality thing. Sometimes it's also like, don't do petitions. Those actually are not read and do not work. And so there's certain things that that are just the basics that we have to happily be able to talk. I mean, you probably know a ton of them anyway, but if we can be of service in the advocacy part, we'd be more than happy to do that.
Yeah, I definitely think that'd be a great one to have at some point in the near future.
Well, I'm actually going to, we have 2 more minutes, but I'm going to stop recording at this time and say thank you to all of our guests, Seana and Larry and Sidra, and for all of your work, and Aiko Sophie for all of your hard work in this area. You know, it's very exciting to see new opportunities that can help people not be at the mercy of the up and down housing market, and you know, and to hear from Seana and Larry about like, how did you get it done? Because so much of this work takes a lot of determination, and it's very long term, and long term is not sexy. It's hard, and it's totally worth it, but it requires a whole lot of this. So thank you on that.